Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to this edition of Reads and Rambles, my still irregularly produced series where I talk about what I've been reading, what I've seen on BookTube, and sometimes what I've been doing in my non-bookish life. First, let me say that here in Washington, D.C. metro area, spring is really here. The temperatures are still quite chilly, but the days are longer and the bulbs are starting to bloom. I'm looking forward to the coming weeks when I can sit out on the porch and spend the afternoons reading. I hope I'll get a few of those days before the next plague is released. And that plague is the once every 17 years emergence of the Brood X cicadas. You'll be hearing a lot more about them, and probably a lot more from them, in my videos this summer. I often start Reads and Rambles videos with a discussion of an essay or review from one of the book review journals I've been reading. I've gotten into the habit of sharing something from perhaps my favorite section of the New York Times Book Review, the By the Book section. Recently, there was an interview with a prolific translator, Margaret Jolcosta, which I really enjoyed. First, she talks about loving Virginia Woolf and George Eliot, and I'm with her there. She even mentions that she's more taken with Eliot's Adam Bede than she is with The Mill and the Floss, as I am, and as I know several other booktubers are as well. She mentions that Portrait of a Lady by Henry James is perhaps her favorite novel of all time, and I must say that while it's been on my future reading list for quite a long time, I still haven't read it. Situating that book amidst so many of my other favorite books definitely makes me eager to finally pick up Portrait of a Lady sooner rather than later. One question that comes up fairly frequently in By the Book interviews is whether a book has ever brought you closer to another person or come between you. Costa tells a lovely story that I'd never quite imagined before, but thought was almost obvious once I read what she said. She talks about a time when she was translating Saramago's Death at Intervals, yet another book I've not read, and met the Dutch translator of the same book. The two of them, as she writes, had a lovely time exchanging problems and solutions as they translated the books into their separate languages. I love the image of the two women puzzling over how to translate meaning and imagery, illusion and sound, and negotiating those issues in different contexts and into different languages. I was reminded of this By the Book discussion when I saw comments by two members of the BookTube community I really admire, Hester Dunlop, commenter extraordinaire, and Jen at the channel Remembered Reads. They were both responding to a video Brian at Bookish put up, a video which engaged with a question currently spreading its way across BookTube about the politics of reading and reviewing diversely. At least at moments, this conversation has addressed the question of what it means when authors say they're not writing for the white gaze, or are not writing for particular audiences. If you haven't read through Brian's comment field, I encourage you to do so. I managed to get myself embroiled in an exciting conversation about what the phrase white gaze or male gaze, etc. means. What both Hester and Jen point out is that translated fiction might give us a way to understand that phrase in a less confrontational way than some people interpret it. Sometimes writers from countries where the primary language is not English choose to write their books in English, targeting their stories for an outside audience. But when authors are not writing in English, they're less likely to be thinking of their audiences as exclusively English-speaking. As Hester writes in one of her comments, reading translated fiction is a good way of being clear that the book wasn't primarily written for me, and helps me get over myself. In other comments, people sometimes use the word problematic, and this usage is really problematic all by itself. We now often use the word to indicate that a person should be censured in some way or even dismissed, but that's not the main historical use of the word. And by historical here, I mean it was not the main use of the word even a decade or two ago. Something that was problematic raised a complicated issue that required intense effort to puzzle out. In fact, when professors problematized an issue, they were turning something we thought of as simple into something we really had to discuss and think about deeply. They were making something problematic, making us see it as a puzzle to be considered. I think that kind of problematic is exactly what Margaret Jolcosta is talking about, that conversation with the Dutch translator about intricate or perplexing passages that require dexterity and thought to convey. What I love about that example is that it shows not only that growth is possible in those conversations, but the pleasure that comes with considering what to do with complex issues where we don't immediately understand what the answers are. In this usage, which is my main usage, problematic indicates the start of a conversation, not its end. Well, let me circle around to a conversation about something I've been reading lately. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. I read it this month for the first time as a buddy read with Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics. I talked recently, maybe in my last Reads and Rambles, about my experience with the first couple of chapters of this book when I tried to read it last summer and decided I was not in the right headspace to read it then. I've said before that I have no interest in reading books that use imagery of sexualized violence without serious analysis or a point to it. Ellison's book has a clear point to it, but nevertheless, his vivid portrayals of that violence was hard for me to take, last summer and this month. To use the line of the day, Ellison, quote, was not writing for me. But I know my response is, at least to a degree, a personal one, and instead of telling you why this book is really not a book for me personally, I want to talk about some of the larger issues the book raises. First, there's a lot I really admire in this book. I really appreciate Ellison's discussion of the different ways racism worked, and still works, in the South versus the North. His main character, who is unnamed, lives in a relatively rural part of the South for his first 2 decades, before moving to the urban North. At first, the character is embarrassed by his Southern roots, but over time he comes to embrace his time there. That is, his personal history and the personal histories of many of the African Americans living in New York. And those Black Southern roots come with not only history, but a deep culture of music and folklore, clothing styles, even games. Ellison uses these styles in a way that's incredibly powerful. His use of the imagery and sounds of jazz is especially resonant. And interestingly, he combines explicit and implicit references to African American folklore with explicit and implicit references to what people often call the standard literary canon, that is, classic works written generally by white authors over the centuries. This is a pretty powerful thing to do. It's a way for Ellison to show that traditionally Black cultural references were just as meaningful to those traditional white cultural references. And Ellison was making that point to both his Black readers and his white readers. Perhaps the most noticeable feature of Invisible Man is Ellison's intense use of motifs and symbols. To be honest, I have mixed feelings about this aspect of the novel. As a reader, I often, but not always, found the repeated symbolism to be enormously overdone. Still, I fully admit that the meanings of the symbols are multivalent. They change over time and over circumstance. Sometimes that kind of conversation within a book, where a symbol is unstable, can persuade me. It does here with the imagery of the shackles, for example. But most of the time I find Ellison's symbolism to be a bit over the top. Let me give one example. There's a scene in chapter 11 where the main character comes to consciousness in a hospital. This is an intense chapter with allusions to a great variety of historical and literary antecedents, and it also circles back to some of the imagery used earlier in the book in different contexts. I'm just going to mention one set of images, rebirth. As the narrator lies on the hospital cot, quote, as if I had just begun to live, as he says, the sounds of the medical machines hum around him, sounding like the cries of women in labor. A huge iridescent bubble seemed to enfold me, he says, suggesting an amniotic sac. Gentle hands moved over me, bringing vague impressions of memory. I was laved with warm liquids. He realizes that he's actually not lying on a cot, but inside a small container with an opening on one side. There's a cord from the machines running to his stomach, or from his stomach to the machines, as if it's an umbilical cord. And in fact, that cord even animates his body in a way that I won't explain here. The narrator doesn't know his own name, and when the doctors ask what his mother's name was, the narrator says, she was the one who screamed when I suffered. As he says it, he again hears the screams of the hospital machines. A machine? My mother? He wonders. He tries to push himself out of the machine and realizes that he's covered in a veil of sweat. And the doctors ask, where were you born? And they inspect his body and finally cut the cord that runs to his belly. The narrator, quote, recoiled inwardly as though the cord were part of me. The nurses clean him up, and he looks from face to face with newborn confusion. And it goes on and on. Any guesses who takes care of him after his rebirth? The saintly Mary, the modern Madonna who wears an apron and sits in a rocking chair, and who seems to be, as the narrator says, a composed figure. Not so surprising given the frequent portrayal of the Madonna in art. There is absolutely nothing subtle about the way Ellison is writing here, and I find his bluntness to be ineffective. Still, I think the heavy-handedness of the symbolism could actually lead to fantastic classroom discussions. Way back in my past, I taught Southern literature each summer to a group of 14 to 15-year-olds. I found it fascinating that the students on the younger side of that age range, no matter how brilliant they were incredibly resistant to believing that authors actually intended to convey motifs or symbols. At the time, I found that Carson McCullers' short novel, A Member of the Wedding, was direct enough in its use of symbolism that with some coaching, even the most suspicious youngsters got on board. I think Ellison's book would be even better for teaching about how aware authors are about how they structure their books and what imagery they use. Of course, some of the themes of Ellison's Invisible Man are really heavy for a summer class for ninth graders. But Ellison's craft, his deliberate structure of circling and the echoing imagery and symbolism would be fantastic for tracking down in a classroom full of readers fairly new to serious literary analysis. To a degree, what I see as Ellison's potential over-reliance on symbolism might be because Ellison is self-consciously writing in response to the literary framework of modernism. Let me back up and point you to Margaret Pinard and her channel and her Marge of the Moderns. Modernist literature was often defined by its emphasis on deep symbolism and some absurdist elements, on a fragmented narrative, which echoes Ellison's use of jazz, which probably inspired the modernist more broadly, and an emphasis on self-discovery and individuality, a theme we'll get to more in a moment. Another aspect of modernism is sometimes the doing away with a clear hero. Instead, we have a protagonist who's lost his faith in society. Ellison's construction of his protagonist, who he introduces as the narrator, is not a clear hero in the way we might expect in a novel from earlier, from the 19th century. The main character is unnamed at the beginning and then repeatedly stripped of names we never know. He lives behind a variety of masks. In this book, very much about identity, we have a character who is explicitly unidentified. This is a story about being dispossessed, even of oneself. And several of the other characters also feel cryptic or masked. One example might be Trueblood. In an early chapter, a man who tells a wild story about impregnating both his wife and his daughter. The white character that hears this story takes it as the truth. And he gives the man a significant amount of money, partly perhaps because he sees himself mirrored in Trueblood's story in some way. But readers aren't supposed to think Trueblood's story is actually true. He is a classic trickster figure, a figure common in folklore who creates a way to survive based on his storytelling abilities. Still, the fact is that none of Ellison's characters feel deeply drawn. Of course, as I've already said, this is actually Ellison's point, but I think this literary choice makes Invisible Man a hard book for character-driven readers to love. There's no one to feel deep concern for. I don't need to identify with a character or like a character, but I struggle if I don't care what happens to any of the characters. Actually, in a comment to one of the assorted BookTube videos about reading and reviewing diverse books, Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse explains that the power of literature is its ability to, quote, expand our hearts. Expand our hearts. And I find it difficult to feel that expansion when none of the characters feel real, but are instead archetypes. In other words, symbols are sometimes a lot more accessible in this book than any of the characters are. And that allows for an embrace of stereotypes that is one of the biggest weaknesses in the book for me. As so many of the white authors of his generation did, authors I sometimes call the mid-century misogynist, Ellison only creates underdeveloped and highly stereotypical women characters. I always get annoyed by authors who don't even try to present female characters with any depth of humanity. But it's even harder to accept when the author's main point is to show how racism erases the humanity of people. He doesn't seem to realize that he erases the humanity of his female characters, black and white. These invisible women are actually just cardboard cutouts of Marys and Eves, of Mother Madonnas, and of oversexed temptresses. And I want to reflect for a moment on how Ellison's novel, despite its analysis of how detrimental racism is, nevertheless sometimes feels to me as if it's been written, as we've been talking about in these BookTube discussions, for that white gaze. At a time when both communism and Marcus Garvey's black nationalism were facing enormous condemnation by both the U.S. government and most of white America, Ellison chooses to mirror that rejection. Yes, many black activists were involved in the early Communist Party, seeing a great hope for equality, only to reject it, not solely because of the Red Scare, but because of racism within the party. But what Ellison does here, in effect, is to embrace the Cold War ideology of anti-communism and anti-black nationalism. He hammers home the central fears of white America and offers in exchange a super commitment to individualism and even a separation from the black community. Is that anti-communist, anti-black nationalist, pro-pluralism, individual above community portrait one of the reasons white critics in the early 1950s, the time of intense racism, was willing to acknowledge the novel's greatness? Note that I am not at all suggesting that Ellison did not deserve the acclaim he received from white critics and audiences, including the National Book Award. But other black authors did not receive this kind of acclaim. Other black authors didn't win the National Book Award, not for decades. Richard Wright didn't win. James Baldwin didn't win. I may be wrong, but I believe Ellison was the only black novelist writing for adults to win the National Book Award until the early 1980s, when Alice Walker won for The Color Purple. I'll be talking about that rather complicated success story very soon. It would be absolutely ridiculous not to see Ellison's book as a major work of literature with enormous strength of craft, whether it matches your personal taste or not, whether it matches your politics or not. But after the discussions recently on BookTube about how the power of the white gaze might affect the books written by authors of color, authors whose reputations depended on what was for a very long time a predominantly white literary circle, I think it's fascinating how even a work that talks as powerfully about racism as Ellison's Invisible Man might also be caught in that web of the white gaze, at least at some level. I'm going to argue here that what both Ellison and his protagonist see is at heart fundamentally conservative. He's arguing, at least it seems to me, for a philosophy that's almost akin to Ayn Rand's, who was writing at roughly the same time Ellison was. Invisible Man is a parable about setting the terms of one's own life to create one's personal meaning totally apart from the group, away from any real connection with other people. From his invisibility, the narrator finds a kind of liberation. That individualism allows him to imagine that he has autonomy, that he has agency. But what does his personal agency mean if it isn't put into use in the service of community? In the same way Ellison does, let me circle around to the beginning of this video now that I'm at the end. At the end of a sunny day this weekend, with bulbs blooming everywhere, my husband and I took a walk around our neighborhood, and I asked David to ponder the ending of the book with me. There are two sentences that leave me a bit confused. At the end of the book, the novel returns to the way it starts, a black man writing in the basement, perhaps an update to the voiceless madwoman in the attic. Of course, his time in hibernation, as he calls it, is not just a literal time in a cellar. It's time he spends in his own head, trying to understand who he is as a solitary individual. After letting go of his literal and figurative baggage, the protagonist of Invisible Man suggests that he will speak out about what he has come to understand. That is, speak about what invisibility has allowed him to see about himself and others. And of course, that is what not only the main character does, but what Ellison himself is doing. The first of the two quotes I asked David about, and which I'm asking you about now, is this one. There is a possibility that even an invisible man has a socially responsible role to play. After the character's rejection of participation in social movements like the Brotherhood and the Black nationalist movement, it isn't hard to imagine that he's ready, after his time underground, to participate in activism again, in some way. But he suggests that the way he will act is as an individual. Fundamentally, is there a time when telling your own story can actually be a political act all by itself? And that socially responsible role. From the very earliest chapters of the book, we know that social responsibility is the exact phrase the White Citizens Council insists the narrator use at the beginning of the book, instead of social equality. What does the main character mean now at the end of the book? Has the meaning shifted? Is he saying that his responsibility is not to the Black community specifically, but to the multiracial society at large in America? The second quote I asked David about is the very last line of the book. Who knows but that on the lower frequencies I speak to you? This is a beautiful line, one that made me cry. Still, I don't know exactly what the author means. What are the lower frequencies? Are they the lower frequencies of music? Is he suggesting that on a deep level, much of humanity shares moments of invisibility, or even that we all share humanity, even if the overtones might be different? Or are these the lower frequencies of radio waves, sound that goes long distances and is not easily impeded by barriers? Is this another example of his embrace of pluralism, of saying that all people, taken as individuals, are part of humanity? Is this another way for the narrator to say that the society he is part of is not primarily the Black community, but a multiracial, pluralist society? Again, while I think most of us would in fact see that as the ultimate goal, if Ellison was choosing to emphasize his acceptance of the Cold War rhetoric of pluralism, does that mean he's deliberately writing for the white gaze? Who is Ellison speaking to when he answers, "I speak to you"? I'll wrap up by saying these words are not meant as a condemnation of Ellison as an author, nor as a condemnation of any author who chooses to write primarily for a white audience instead of a broad human audience, perhaps especially if they're making that decision in the context of the early 1950s. Still, I was struck by the confluence of the BookTube question du jour and the reading I was doing this week, and I wanted to share my questions and thoughts and hear your responses. Thanks for putting up with me today, and thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.